The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise in this important day in the House of Commons today, and I do so with a deep sense of responsibility. Responsibility as a member of this House, Mr. Speaker. I've said on numerous occasions, both in this place and outside, that one of the most important decisions or debates that a member of the House of Commons will take part in is the decision related to putting the men and women of the Canadian Forces into harm's way. It's a decision that should be used sparingly, Mr. Speaker, but it is also a decision that, as a democratic and a leader of middle powers in the world, Mr. Speaker, we should also exercise when our values and indeed freedoms are at risk. It's also a deep responsibility, Mr. Speaker, for me as a Canadian, because it's at decisions like this that we define the type of Canadians we are. Are we Canadians like our forebears, who with a young and small country stepped up and served in a way that was much larger than its population might have dictated in the past? Are we a nation that doesn't move to the other side of the road as we pass people whose freedoms and very lives are being threatened, hoping that someone else will tend to them? Are we the type of Canadians, Mr. Speaker, in a global age where we benefit immensely from trade and are one of the wealthiest countries in the world? Do we allow ourselves to fall asleep under the blanket of security that our distance from these conflicts also always allows us to have? So before the House, Mr. Speaker, is a debate on the motion for the next phase in our response to the ISIL threat. On September 5th, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister outlined that Canada's initial response was to send military advisors to help Iraqi and Kurdish forces in the defense of their territories and to stop killings on a genocidal scale, Mr. Speaker. That mission is now over and is being extended, and we're also evolving into an airstrike role for Canada, Mr. Speaker. But who is that threat that is ISIL? I think all Canadians have been horrified by the accounts we've seen on television. Beheading of journalists and aid workers, the selling of women and young girls into slavery, rape as a weapon of war, mass killings on a scale that is truly genocide, Mr. Speaker. And ISIL is a threat. It's an enemy, Mr. Speaker, of freedom, an enemy that follows no creed except death and destruction. And as Canadians, indeed, as part of the developed and democratic world, if we learned anything from 9/11, Mr. Speaker, it's that navel-gazing and turning a blind eye to these threats, because they are far away, can allow them to gather to a point where they also touch us, Mr. Speaker. So when we see some of the children being impacted by this horrific violence in Iraq and Syria, Mr. Speaker, we should also see the faces of our own children. We should not allow this threat to gather, because, Mr. Speaker, we've already seen, sadly, a few radicalized Canadians are taking part in these horrific acts. ISIL has already threatened Canada, Mr. Speaker. And with the vast amount of territory and financing they've gained in recent months, they are a threat not just to that region, Mr. Speaker, but to the entire world. And, Mr. Speaker, with our immense freedoms and wealth as a nation comes a duty to safeguard and promote these same opportunities for others. And that is why I stand in full agreement with our evolving role, Mr. Speaker, to combat the threat that is ISIL. We are now going to extend the training mission and the advisory commission, Mr. Speaker, with select members of our Special Forces unit, but we're also going to deploy surveillance aircraft, an air-to-air refueling Polaris, and up to 6 CF-18s to join our allies, both our NATO allies, Mr. Speaker, but also allies in the Gulf, to combat the advance of ISIL. This is an appropriate response, Mr. Speaker, because it can be effective. It can cut off supply and financing lines for ISIL. It can isolate them in a geography and allow some of the domestic ground forces to defend their own territory. And we see how close, Mr. Speaker, this is drifting even to our NATO ally of Turkey. Airstrikes can have a limited but impactful role on stopping genocide and stopping the advance of ISIL. It's also, Mr. Speaker, much lower risk for our men and women of the Canadian Forces. There is risk whenever you're flying in combat, but this is a risk that is limited. And I know the exceptional men and women of our Royal Canadian Air Force, Mr. Speaker, train and accept these risks as part of their duty for our country and for our values. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, these are targeted and precision strikes that are assessed both before the strike and after to minimize collateral damage, Mr. Speaker. We learn on these assessments. We learn if an impact is being felt on the ground and if we're saving lives and preventing the advance of ISIL. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to address some of the concerns raised by the opposition in the debate in the weeks before this mission. First, they suggest that Canada is running into this airstrike role, rushing into battle, as I've heard some members of this House say. Mr. Speaker, if that was the case, we would have joined the first round of countries committing or implementing airstrikes. On September 5th, the Prime Minister outlined our decision, which was an advisory one for the first month, and that we would speak to our allies and see what is needed going further. Canada has always played a role that's helpful, commensurate with our size and scope as a country. And that's what we're doing here, Mr. Speaker. Members of this House have also said, what is our exit strategy, Mr. Speaker? Throwing out suggestions like that as an excuse not to stand with our allies in the face of this threat. Well, Mr. Speaker, an airstrike role is limited. Our crews are able to return and assess the impact of their last mission. They are not on the ground, Mr. Speaker. And as the Prime Minister said in this House, there are no combat troops being deployed on the ground with this motion. Another element of debate, Mr. Speaker, has been how do we measure success? Once again, if we can't measure success, we shouldn't stand along our allies, and we shouldn't hear the cries from the thousands suffering as a result of ISIL. Well, with airstrikes, Mr. Speaker, as I said, we can measure the impact of our role in that area. We can measure if we've isolated ISIL and allowed Kurdish or Iraqi ground forces to safeguard their own interests. And, Mr. Speaker, this cries out for a quote from Winston Churchill. No one can guarantee success in war, but only deserve it. Mr. Speaker, the coalition forces, in the face of horrific acts of violence and genocide, certainly deserve success. And as the Prime Minister said, this is not a case of either humanitarian aid or counterterrorism operations. It's a case of both, Mr. Speaker. And without security on the ground, as we've seen through the tragic beheading last week, we cannot deliver humanitarian aid to the people that need it. Now, the NDP opposition in this House, Mr. Speaker, is understandable. It's a party that has been very, very reticent about deploying Canadian forces throughout its history. But what is deeply troubling to me, Mr. Speaker, as a parliamentarian, has been not just the position of the third party, the Liberal Party, in this debate, but their approach to the debate itself. And to highlight that, Mr. Speaker, I'm showing another Liberal leader's speech in this place on September 8, 1939. Prime Minister King, in response to Conservative support for his motion. It shows how deep in the breasts of men lies the determination to preserve, to maintain, and defend freedom, and all that freedom makes possible in the enjoyment of life itself. This is a deep-lying instinct for freedom is, I believe, characteristic of the citizens of Canada from one end of this great country to the other. A deep-lying instinct for freedom, Mr. Speaker. Comments from the Liberal leader in 1939 in response to the Conservative Party's support for his motion in the House regarding the deployment of men and women at a time of need. Contrast that, Mr. Speaker, to the comments of today's Liberal leader, flippant when it comes to the situation that ISIL poses, derogatory of our ability to project force alongside our allies. Mr. Speaker, where has the Liberal Party gone? Is a question I'm leaving with this House. Where is their deep-lying instinct for freedom, Mr. Speaker? I hope they find it soon. Thank you.